Welcome back to the DrupalEasy podcast. This is season 16, episode number 4. My name is Mike Ganello, aka Ultimike, and in today's episode, I'll be talking with Kevin Quillen about a book he recently co-authored with Matt Glomman, Drupal 10 Development Cookbook. We'll also take a few minutes to talk about the OpenAI/ChatGPT integration module that Kevin is a maintainer of. Before we get to all that, let me tell you about DrupalEasy's long-form Drupal training courses. Our beginner-focused Drupal career online is now in its 12th year, and we've graduated hundreds of students in that time frame. We think of the DCO as holistic Drupal training. Not only do we teach you Drupal, but also many of the best practice tools and skills related to being a successful professional Drupal developer. This class meets twice a week for 12 weeks starting on February 12th. You can learn more at DrupalEasy.com/DCO. Our newest long-form Drupal training course is called Professional Module Development. Now, we actually offer this course in two versions, a full version and a light version. The full version meets twice a week for 15 weeks, and the light version meets twice a week for 9 weeks. We go deep into services and dependency injection, as well as lots of automated tests, plugins, and several of Drupal core's APIs. Class begins January 30th. Learn more at DrupalEasy.com/PMD. Welcome, Kevin Quillen, to the DrupalEasy podcast. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. We wanted to have you on the podcast to talk about sort of a recent book. It's been out for almost a year now, I guess, February of 2023, called Drupal 10 Development Cookbook that you co-wrote with Matt Glomman. This is just one of those things that's been on my radar for a while, and I wanted to talk to you about it. And now I finally have the opportunity. So thanks for coming on and thanks for making the time. So I know that you have been on Drupal.org for over 15 years. So you're a longtime Drupaler like myself, and you're quite the prolific contributor in all areas. We'll have a link to your profile in the show notes as well. You're also, I have principal developer / principal Drupal practice lead at Velir. Did I say Velir correctly?
Yes, you're correct.
All right, fantastic. You want to tell us about, Velir and what you do for Velir a little bit more, maybe?
Sure. Velir is a full-service digital agency. We're based out of Boston, Massachusetts. We primarily deal with nonprofits, higher ed, healthcare industry, and various other clients. I've been with them almost 10 years now.
Wow.
But as you mentioned, been working with Drupal since version 5, a very long time now.
How'd you get into Drupal in the first place? What's your Drupal origin story?
That's another long conversation. I'll try to keep it short, but way back in the day, in a different lifetime, we were building in the mid 2000s proprietary software with Cold Fusion. If anyone remembers the language Cold Fusion, we had a CMS and a commerce application and a CRM application, and over time, it just got harder and harder to maintain the code base with a small amount of staff as we gained more clients and gain more projects, and trying to develop the product as supporting at the same time was really difficult. And I think it was like 2006, maybe. Open source platforms were kind of a new thing. It wasn't really a known thing like it is today. So I think there was one weekend where I had to sit down and build a feature it's been common in systems like Drupal for many years. I just kind of took a look out there and thought, has anybody solved this problem before? I think we're really trying to build a menu or something very, very trivial. And started thinking, well, what if we just shifted our efforts to an established platform that has a community? Again, a very new idea at the time, to take kind of the burden off of us from doing basically building the same feature and the same task on every single project that was hard to maintain. It was just slightly different. So every single project you had to have context over the project and who worked on it and who developed it. And the code was just different. It was crazy. So we spent a month kind of trialing the idea of, can we build a site in Drupal? We didn't know anything about Drupal. We didn't know anything about PHP or the Linux hosting, et cetera, because it's all Cold Fusion and Java. And made the transition. And one of our very first Drupal projects was for the Dogfish Head Craft Brewery, which is a local, well, at the time was a local brewery here. And now they're very well known nationally. They were built on Drupal 5 and then quickly redone on Drupal 6 because the upgrade was very simple back then. And then at that point, we started just getting rid of Cold Fusion very, very rapidly because the productivity gains in using an established system like Drupal were very, very clear. We didn't have to redo someone had to come in and be an expert in a WYSIWYG to know how to implement that or how to implement content types was basically the big selling point for me. Seeing how easy it was with CCK and a system to go through and point and click and create your content model and add your fields was it in 2006 was mind blowing, and it's still a killer feature of Drupal today. How easy it is to do that without writing any code. That just kickstarted the whole thing, and I've been inside of Drupal ever since.
Yeah, your origin story is not all that different from mine and not all that different from a lot of other folks that we've interviewed on the podcast over the years that kind of joined the community in the Drupal 4, Drupal 5, Drupal 6 days. It's just we were all, building custom content management systems over and over and over again for our clients and until we had enough and
Yeah.
eventually found Drupal. How did you find your way to writing a book?
So I've been approached in the past by Packt Publishing over the years, and I never really had. I didn't have the time to kind of dedicate to that, but it was always something on my list of life goals to do. At least write a book. I certainly put out plenty of blog articles over the years. That when they came to me, I think last year, somewhere in the summer, they asked if I wanted to participate in helping complete this Drupal 10 book. And when I asked them who the co-author was, and they said Matt Glanwin, I said I'm 100%. I'm in. Matt's, of course, a legend in the community, and he puts out very, very well written, very thoughtful pieces and great contribution work. So I wanted to be a part of that in any way that I could, and I thought that'd be a great first step. I wouldn't have to, produce an entire book. I can do just the half of it. Be a good starting point for me to step into that because the timeline was very tight. So I figured, I could probably do the required amount of content in the dates they had given me, as opposed to writing the full thing by that point. So I said I'll do it, and it was a great opportunity.
What was the state of the book when you joined the project? Were just chapters missing, or were you like, what was the?
Yeah, so Matt had it's a continuation of the previous Drupal cookbooks, but of course a lot has changed since 8 and even in some ways 9 to produce this new book. So a majority of the chapters were there, but we had to redo some of the initial ones and then replace kind of the latter ones with all new stuff that's all new in Drupal 10 and some different topics. So he had rewritten and updated all the parts for the beginning of the book on those initial topics and refreshed it for 10, and then I stepped in to finish the last half of the book. I think there were some obligations going on. That's why I came in to kind of help out there. So the chapters were already pre-selected. Fortunately, the chapters that I was doing is something we do like on every single project. So that was another benefit to me of first time writing a book. It happens to be content I was very, very, very well familiar with and able to produce that pretty quickly.
Yeah, I found, having that confidence when you're just getting something rolling is super important. How about the pattern of the book is, it's not like I don't say it's not like a lot of other programming books, but it's definitely it has an overriding structure. Like every section has a cookbook style structure of, you know, getting ready. How do you actually do it? How does it work? Then going a little bit deeper. I think that was in there's a there's more section. Did you find it difficult to kind of adhere to that structure?
Maybe at first it was a different approach to writing for me. I don't, of course, write articles, blog articles like that for Lear or my own site. And for me, growing up, I've been around the block long enough that the gold standard in any technical manual for me was always the O'Reilly programming books on any subject that he ever produced. So that was my mindset going into it, and I had to kind of take a couple steps back and find ways of fitting in the things you want to say into this framework, which is consistent through the book. So I had to take a step back and say, okay, for these chapters, I need to think back through actual projects that we have done and think of a problem scenario and then set that up for the reader. Because the other thing that I've learned from all those technical books of the past is, for me anyway, I learn better when the example is a real world problem, a scenario to attack, and not just kind of a generic scenario. So the chapters on migration, or especially the chapters about approaching testing or multilingual content, putting that kind of real world framing on it, I think tracks better with people who may be encountering the same things on their projects.
So one thing I thought was interesting, the word development is right in the title, but
Mhm.
this isn't a book that's only for developers by any stretch. Because there's a lot of site building, there's a lot of contributed module configuration stuff in there. Was that the plan all along? Is the title just, Drupal development, within the community? I think a lot of times when folks say that they're a developer, they're talking about coding as opposed to site building. So kind of what was the plan regarding contributed modules, specifically?
Yep. I think there was kind of a multifaceted approach here. I think one was to be inclusive of people who and also encouraging, like, people say they're a developer, they may not be. It depends on their definition, right? So if people think developer, they think they're a complete expert in all things coding, and that's when they see that, they get a little apprehensive to even approaching either reading material or tutorials if they think it's going to be a heavy amount of coding. So by starting off the book, and I think it just continues all the way through, by taking like a site builder aspect to it up front and then say, okay, if you wanted to tinker with it a little bit, here are some code examples to do that, just to show how easy it is to, even on the advanced topics, how to kind of jump in and make modifications or alterations. And once, because this was true for me way back in Drupal 5, once you've done that first little bit of modification, whether it's a form alter or adding a menu item hook, then your confidence starts to build. And the more confidence you have in, taking a hold of code and just jumping in and doing it, for people who aren't, wouldn't call themselves a developer, they suddenly get on the track to being one. And then the book definitely applies to people across the entire spectrum, whether you're new to any of this or you're a seasoned expert in Drupal development. I think there's something to learn there for everyone.
Yeah, that's one thing I definitely wanted to bring to the forefront, that this is definitely not a book just for coders. There's a lot of really good information on various contributor modules, and I don't want to even like it's almost like a little bit of an eclectic list of contributor modules. There's the four I wrote down are workspaces, views, obviously views, layout builder core module as well. But then the charts module, I was kind of surprised to see examples on that in there. But all that being said, there's still plenty of code in this book. I mean, there's a whole chapter. I think it's a whole chapter, maybe it's a whole section with multiple chapters on automated testing.
Mhm.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say the it's kind of hard to avoid code when you're talking about automated testing, but that was a chapter I think I really wanted to get in that book, because for me, going back through not even just various Drupal books, but other technical books in general, is very, very hard to find information on automated testing. And not just, most books will say, here's how you do it, but there's no like the intuition and the why, and kind of the what they would call the art of testing is kind of lacking there. So when and this was true for me many years ago, where it's like I would write tests but I don't know how. But it's like, well, I can show you how, but it doesn't give you that kind of the insight of when, knowing when to do it and how to do it and what makes kind of a valuable test. So we tried to include, that's the one area of the book that kind of breaks that framework that we talked about above, because I really wanted to get those, I think it's 2 or 3 pages into that chapter, like explaining why you want to do this and what each kind of test is, to help folks understand where it's applicable and where you'd want to use that. So that was very important for me to get in there, because I can remember back when, before I did any of it, it was really hard to find any information other than the standard books. I think there's like a Kent Beck book on test driven development and a couple other books that can tell you the methodology, but then you want to apply that to put it in like a Drupal sense of like within the CMS, what kind of tests am I looking at? How can I write a test? And then I think the chapter takes you through like the unit test, which is your very basic, very small code only test, all the way through a functional browser test. I think we're using starting with vanilla code and working into a field formatter, and I think a migration plugin to kind of demonstrate how it all works. So it's kind of rolls it up into a full example by the end of the chapter. But that was, for me, very important to get in there, because it's a very critical aspect of talking about people in the path to development, becoming, getting better at what you do. And again, when you put tests against the work that you've done and they pass, that builds the internal confidence too. You know
Right.
for a fact that your code is working, instead of kind of guessing and saying, well, it was working yesterday, maybe not today. And that just, there's so many hours wasted there for people trying to debug what is the problem? Is it the problem? Is it my code? Is it contributed code? Is it someone else's code? It just eliminates all that fuss. So that was a very important thing for me to add to the book.
Yeah, I find it's really difficult to communicate when to write a test and which kind of test, because all projects are going to have a timeline and a budget. And very few projects are ever going to achieve anything close to 100% test coverage, right?
Yes.
And it takes a special client to understand the value of the tests and to pay for those tests to be written. So understanding all of that and then being able to, sell to clients that, hey, it would make sense for us to spend a day and a half writing a functional test for this bit because it's especially tricky, or a kernel test for this. And I was really impressed that, the chapter includes everything from unit tests all the way up through Nightwatch JS tests as well. So it's a pretty comprehensive chapter. I was pretty impressed by.
Yeah.
One big oh, go ahead.
I was it just, we're from the same area of thought, where back in the day it was, if it wasn't 100% test coverage, then you didn't have test coverage at all. That's for core, that's a very good principle to follow. But on the day-to-day projects that we do, my mantra is more like, well, what's the critical path here? What parts of the code are mission critical to this application? The superficial items we don't need to spend a ton of time like fretting over writing automated tests for. But if you're writing like single sign-on that has custom behaviors after there's someone is logged in, or you're working with cookies and any things that take QA personnel a very long time to do manually, and you have to do it every single deployment, every single regression. That's like when you start to see, okay, here's where the value lies for this test. And over here, maybe we don't need to do this right now. We can do this later, but absolutely want to do this up front, because the more code you add over time, if it's the less tests you have, the harder it gets to go back through and figure out where the problems are. So in terms of, you'll hear pushback from managerial types that, oh, there's no budget for this, there's no hours for this. But I usually go rogue and say, okay, I'm going to pad my estimate a little bit because I know I'm going to come back and put this in just for my own sanity. And it's going to pay off later, because if you don't do it and it breaks later, you're going to do it anyway. You're going to spend 2 or 3 times the amount of time trying to figure out what the problem is, what the remediation is, versus having it up front.
Exactly. Yeah. All right. So I have one nitpick I have with this book. I was astounded that I did not see, and granted, I did not read every single word. I read some chapters and skimmed other chapters. You did not, well, I shouldn't say you and Matt did not use Drush Generate for any of the examples that I noticed. And I'm just curious why. I mean, that for me, that's a go-to tool for writing modules or plugins or whatever.
Right. I think if I could go back, or if we go back, that's probably something we would add towards the end of the book. The structure of the chapters, we didn't really have a ton of flexibility in. We couldn't really add additional sections. But in like from my perspective, initially, the goal in the way that I learned, how to transition into Drupal 8 was I did all the code. Like I knew Drush Generate existed. I knew Drupal console existed, but I didn't want to kind of generate and then not understand how a controller works, or how the new entity definition codes work, or how to define a field formatter. So if we could go back and add that to the end of the book, like, okay, now that you know all these things, here are tools that can accelerate you through once you understand how these things are constructed. I just think we just ran out of time and didn't have enough leeway with the publisher to like, we need to add this and add that and add the other, because they were sticking to a schedule. But yeah, generally, especially in the age of like artificial intelligence and people generating code, my only advice there is to, if you don't know it, try to do it hands-on first. And then once you have a good grasp of how it works, and it's all wired together, then come back through to Dress Generate and all the generational tools, because you'll know by looking at it that it's correct or not.
Yeah, I have a very similar spiel talking about Git. I'm like, don't worry about using a GUI with Git. Learn Git on the command line first, understand what it's doing, and then move on to a pretty interface if you want. So there's an entire chapter on working with custom entities written in code. And this is one of those things where when I'm working on a project with some of our folks, some of our contractors, inevitably someone will say, "Oh, we should just make a custom, a custom entity for that." And for some reason, I'm always the first one to push back on it because I feel like there's a lot of code there. There's a lot of effort that goes into creating a custom entity in code. And I'm curious, just from it doesn't really have as much to do with the book, but you or Matt wrote a chapter on it. So what are like some use cases that you've seen where it makes sense to do a custom entity in code?
This is it's been a popular question since Drupal 7, I guess, when the entity API was first introduced. Like automated testing, it's one of those things that it comes with experience. Like you'll get to a point where you know when and where to do that. I think Drupal Commerce is a great example of that, where they have commerce, orders, products, payments, and everything lives as its own thing. But to make it, in my opinion, very, very simple, if you have data that is not considered publishable content, let's say like publication content, which I would consider
Right.
nodes. We've had projects where we had to deal with kind of a pseudo reservation booking system for university, where it showed different libraries across the campus and the different rooms that they had available. And it was all managed entirely in Drupal, but we decided to treat those as custom entities. So, one benefit there immediately is it doesn't, if you create it as a content type on a node, it's automatically opted into everything that nodes are opted into. So you have to remember to go back through and take it out of your sitemaps, take it out of your views, take it out of your search, take it out of your role permissions. But if you do a custom entity, it's the other way around. It has to come back through and opt into everything that you want to do. So if you want to protect that data and keep it isolated away, custom entity is the way to go. And I think Drupal Commerce is probably the best example of that, of why you'd want to do that. The separation is great. And in Drupal 8, 8, 9, and 10, that creating a custom entity doesn't remove anything from you. It still has the ability to be fieldable, still can create bundles, it still can be used in views. So it's just a matter of knowing exactly when and where those cases arise. In my opinion, like we faced it a couple of times this year, and we've ultimately opted to say, this is a content type that's like right online. This is a content type, but if it had a couple more requirements, we'd probably go a custom entity route with that, knowing all the different pieces that can happen when you just create, a one-off content type for whatever reason.
Yeah, I rarely go with custom entities just because the amount of code that's necessary can really balloon on that. So I'm always looking for ways to avoid it. And honestly, it's a lot of times, like you said, it has to do with access control of data. So I end up using things like ECK, the Entity Construction Kit, or even paragraphs, which do not have a path to every paragraph entity. They always have to be embedded in something. So I was curious to pick your brain on that a little bit. There's also entire chapters on working with forms and plugins, custom entity types I mentioned. So let me ask you one more question about the book. And I just interviewed, and I don't know if that episode of the podcast is going to come out before or after this one, but Luca Lusso, who wrote the Drupal 10 theming book recently, and I asked him a very similar question. So, if imagine there's a developer who's comfortable with basic Drupal module development skills, hook form alter, maybe a custom block plugin, something like that. If they're looking to up their Drupal development skills, their module development skills, I should say, what are the next 2 or 3 things that you think they should learn? Like, where should they focus their time once they kind of know the absolute, maybe they know routes and controllers and stuff as well?
I think there's probably two paths there, depending on the interests of that individual. One, of course, if you're trying to become, up your skills across the board, becoming a core contributor is a way to do that. Whether it's beginner to expert is one
Uh,
way to get, because you get exposed to so many different kinds of problems that you wouldn't maybe not see on a normal day-to-day project.
that's a big first step, though. That's a big first, you wouldn't recommend, like, maybe a well-used or well-maintained contrib module?
That's the second pass. So it's
Okay,
clearly
got it.
easier to also get started on the contributed side of things. Pick a module that you like, or find one that may need a little bit of updates, and start chipping in on whatever it needs. That's the second path is the one I chose way back when, because you just start working with code. You get to experience different. You get exposure to people in the community and working together with people, and finding the best path forward for that. And when it all comes together and it works, it's a great feeling. Whether or not using it on a production project, could just be something you do on the side. It's the point is, the more code that you write, and the more documentation that you write, and the more people that you work with, it's all experience in the end. You don't have to wait for the project to come in the door first before you start to work on it.
See, that's an answer I didn't expect. Because I kind of expected that you would suggest, like, learn how to use PHP Stan, or learn like how to create a custom form in Drupal, or something like that. But you went kind of the route of, it's more almost a more holistic approach. Is just get involved somewhere that you can learn from existing code and other folks in the community.
Mhm. Oh, I thought for someone who already had some initial grounding in Drupal. So I mean, yeah, like form alter, I call it the gateway drug into Drupal. That's always like the first easiest thing to do, that you can see the result immediately, and then it's like, oh wow, this is really cool. And then you understand the hook system, that everything behaves that way, and it's just a matter of which parts you want to modify, and then kind of working from there. But sure, like, yeah, like just working with as much code as possible, of any kind of functionality is just a great way to build your skills as a developer.
No, I liked your answer, though, because if you can get involved in an issue queue in a community project, you're going to learn. You're going to learn a lot,
Mhm.
right? There's going to be issues there that you're gonna have to dig into, and maybe they weren't written well, so you're gonna have to try and figure out what they're talking about, and maybe reproduce an error, and you're going to be learning no matter what. So
Basically, exposing yourself to things you don't, whether it's Drupal or PHP or not, just get involved in different technologies.
yeah,
Like I like to dabble in my limited free time in Go and Rust, and try to contribute to DDev and just different projects to just try to have either a voice or impact on those different things and learn at the same time. So you do reach a point where you can't really go too farther. You hit that kind of plateau, and then it's time to look around at different technologies. And then even sometimes you can find ideas and skills that you didn't know about in those different platforms, and then bring them back into Drupal, which I think we've seen with 8, 9, and 10.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So you mentioned Drush Generate was something that if you had more time, you might want to
Mhm.
go back in time and sneak stuff in. Was there anything else any other topics that were kind of on the radar that you didn't have time to get in?
Oh, there's two. So with the testing chapter, I wanted to do like another. I could do another 20 or 30 pages with Drupal test traits as like the icing on the cake of.
Okay. All right.
I don't if people haven't used it. It's a way to do functional browser testing using the existing database. You don't have to like kind of scaffold out
Right.
all the mock data and all the modules. It uses the database in place to run a test. It's was a lifesaver for me on a project last year where it was a real crunch, and I didn't have time to go through and like I needed tests, but I didn't have time to go through and scaffold out the functional browser requirements because it's a pretty hefty site. But you put Drupal test traits in, it's the same process. It uses Selenium and Chrome. It's a headless browser orchestrator, and it goes through the tests just like it would for a normal functional test. That is it's a phenomenal tool. I think Moshe Weitzman, of course, is another legend in the community behind that, and behind Drush and other great projects. That's I could write so much about that because it's another. I think if I had to do it again, because it's like if you don't understand testing, it if you pick that first and you set it up, it's kind of easier to see what's happening because you don't have to deal with the scaffolding code part of
Right.
writing tests, which a lot of people get hung up on. You can just kind of get in and start poking around and say, oh, I can use PHP to control
Yeah, that
browser.
could be 80% of your test.
Yeah,
Yeah.
end-to-end test. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is, if we could do it again, knowing what I know now, I do an entire chapter on the ECA module, the event condition action module
Okay.
at the probably near the end to like to bring it all together because it incorporates everything that you've may have done as a developer or maybe as a site builder for plugins and integrations and actions and rules and everything like that.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that. It's a great module. I'm definitely using it on most of my site builds these days. All right, so let's switch gears real quick. I have a couple minutes left with you. You are one of the maintainers, the main maintainer of the OpenAI ChatGPT integration module, correct?
Yes.
So for those listeners who haven't played with it yet, it basically integrates pretty well with Drupal on an entity, add edit pages where it can suggest tags or summary or title. So I don't know if you've been working on it lately, but kind of what's as fast as AI is moving these days, do you have any plans for that module evolving in the short term?
Yeah, we recently gave a demonstration of this module at Aqua Engage 2 weeks ago up in Boston. And that the response to this module has been well beyond what I ever expected. This really just started as I was just curious of like, what is ChatGPT and is there anything to this and what would it look like in a CMS? And it kind of just it took off out of nowhere. So AI is moving so fast. It's probably faster than the JavaScript ecosystem, if I can make a tiny joke there. It's really, really difficult to keep up with what's changing every day and the startups that are coming and going to know where it has legs, right? So we've tried to focus just from a content manager's perspective in Drupal, like where would that benefit them the most? And if you're familiar with the module, everyone loves the CK editor integration because it's like plugged right in
Right.
and kind of maybe the best demonstration of, oh, look, there's stuff happening on the screen and I can go to a field and say, what's the SEO version of this, a better SEO version of this, or is this too graphic for different audiences, or it'll tell you all kinds of things that really just started as a proof of concept that people are using in production today. But earlier this month, we released the final three endpoints really of speech to text. You can upload an audio file or a video, and it'll give you a transcript of that file. It'll also transcribe that file into I believe, different languages if you wanted to.
Yep.
And the text to speech obviously is the reverse. You can upload a text document, and it'll give you an audio file spoken back by AI of that content. And then we integrated the DALI endpoint, which is the image generation endpoint with OpenAI as a screen in Drupal. And then once I got to that point, we also gave me the opportunity to create like an internal API wrapper on top of the OpenAI client wrapper. And then we could step back and we made an integration with ECA. That was the last release we did. So
Yeah, that's the one I actually wanted to bring up. Yeah.
so you can go through and create an ECA model, and then there's a couple of actions in there for interacting with ChatGPT, like the completions, the chats, the text to speech and speech to text. And we're working on the moderation, content moderation as a condition, which I'm going back and forth with Jurgen on how to best do that and implement other things as we go along. So that's kind of like how we're going to, or how I would see we democratize access to AI. Because right now, the only people that can really interface with it are developers, or if you use the ChatGPT site. But once it's in ECA, then we don't have to write all the code to facilitate the myriad of ways people would want to integrate AI with this. We just give them the power to create the workflow themselves. As long as the API wrapper works great, then it's kind of, the sky's the limit.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, we could do a whole podcast episode on that, but I didn't want to let that go before before I let you go. So I do appreciate the update on that. So, Kevin, thank you very much for your time today. I appreciate it. I hope everyone has a chance to check out the Drupal 10 Development Cookbook. The link will be in the show notes. And yeah, thank you very much for your time, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to the DrupalEasy podcast. Don't forget to check out all of our long-form Drupal training courses at DrupalEasy.com and stay tuned for the next episode of the DrupalEasy podcast. See ya!